The People's Lawyer, The Taming of the Money Trust. Part 1. The Invisible Throne. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was not a republic of citizens, but a kingdom of capital. It was the Gilded Age, an era of grotesque opulence and grinding poverty, where titans of industry built marble palaces in Newport, while families starved in the tenements of New York. The nation's railroads, its steel mills, its oil fields, and its political machinery were all puppets, and the strings were held by a small, interwoven group of men in Lower Manhattan. They were not elected, they answered to no one, and their power was absolute. They were collectively known by a whispered, fearful name: the Money Trust. This was not a formal organization with a charter and a headquarters. It was a fluid, organic financial leviathan, a network of interlocking directorates and holding companies centered around a handful of investment banks. At its undisputed heart sat one man, a figure of such immense power and gravitas that he seemed less a man than a force of nature. His name was John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan was the embodiment of American capitalism in its most raw and untamed form. A stout man with a bulldog's build, a booming voice, and fiercely piercing eyes, his very presence radiated an aura of unshakable authority. His disfigured, bulbous nose, the result of a chronic skin condition, only added to his intimidating mystique, as if he were a battle-scarred deity of finance. He did not merely participate in the economy, he commanded it. He had organized U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. He had consolidated warring railroads into massive, efficient monopolies. When the U.S. government itself ran short of gold in 1895, it was Morgan, not the Treasury, who organized a private syndicate to bail out the nation. Presidents sought his counsel. European kings sought his loans. He was the de facto central bank of the United States, and his office at 23 Wall Street, the corner, was the financial capital of the world. To the public, Morgan and his associates were either heroic captains of industry or villainous robber barons. But to a certain type of man, the kind that understood the intricate machinery of law and finance, they represented something far more dangerous, a professional betrayal of the highest order. They had perverted the principles of a free market, replacing competition with consolidation and opportunity with an exclusive, self-serving club. One such man was Samuel Untermyer. On the surface, Untermyer was everything the Gilded Age celebrated. He was a brilliant, phenomenally successful corporate lawyer, one of the most feared and respected litigators in New York. A self-made man, the son of German Jewish immigrants, he had become a millionaire before the age of 30. He lived a life of extraordinary luxury, with a grand Fifth Avenue mansion, a sprawling country estate named Greystone with 150 rooms and dozens of greenhouses, and a world-renowned art collection. He moved in the same circles as the men of the Money Trust. He understood their language, their methods, and their immense systemic power. He was an insider. But unlike them, Untermyer possessed a restless reformist spirit and a towering, almost arrogant belief in the supremacy of the law. He was a small, dapper man with a meticulously trimmed mustache and intense, probing eyes, but in the courtroom He was a giant. His mind was a legal scalpel, capable of dissecting the most complex financial structures with terrifying precision. And as he watched the power of the money trust grow, he became increasingly offended, not just on a moral level, but on a professional one. He saw their consolidations not as genius, but a clumsy, brutish suffocation of the American economic spirit. He saw their control as a threat to the very fabric of the democratic ideal. Their hubris, their belief that they were above scrutiny, was an affront to his core belief that no man, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The catalyst for his eventual crusade was the Panic of 1907. A series of failed speculative gambles by lesser financiers triggered a massive financial crisis. Banks failed, credit dried up, and the stock market plummeted. The nation stood on the brink of total economic collapse. With no central bank to act as a lender of last resort, the country turned once again to J.P. Morgan. From his library on Madison Avenue, Morgan summoned the presidents of the nation's major banks. For days, he locked them in, forcing them to pool their resources and shore up the teetering financial system. He personally decided which firms would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. He was, for a terrifying week, the economic dictator of the United States. He saved the country, but in doing so, he proved beyond any doubt where the real power lay. And in the aftermath, his own empire emerged stronger and more consolidated than ever. The public was both grateful and terrified. The panic laid bare the fundamental weakness of the nation's financial system and the terrifying power of a few private individuals. A cry for reform echoed across the country, from the farms of the Midwest to the halls of Congress. In Washington, a progressive Democratic congressman from Louisiana, Arsène Pujol, chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, was tasked with investigating the concentration of financial power. Pujol was a respectable politician, but he knew he was out of his depth. To take on Wall Street, he needed a guide, a legal gunslinger who knew the territory and wasn't afraid of a fight. He needed someone who could not be bought, bullied, or outsmarted. He needed Samuel Untermyer. When Pujol's invitation arrived, Untermyer saw it for what it was, the case of a lifetime. This was not just another corporate lawsuit. This was a chance to put the entire financial system on trial before the American people. It was an opportunity to challenge the gods of Olympus, to hold them accountable before the American people. He accepted the role as chief counsel for the committee pro bono. He would not take a single dollar for his services. This was not to be a revenge of passion or violence. It was to be a cold, meticulous, and entirely intellectual form of revenge. Untermyer would not use a sword or a pistol. His weapons would be subpoenas, cross-examinations, and an unparalleled understanding of corporate law. His goal was not to send men to jail, but to dismantle their mystique, to expose the inner workings of their invisible empire to the harsh light of public scrutiny, and to shatter the throne from which they ruled. The great hunt had begun.
Part 2. Mapping the Leviathan. Samuel Untermyer approached the Pujol Committee investigation not as a lawyer preparing for a trial, but as a general preparing for war. He knew he was facing an enemy with limitless resources and an army of the best legal minds money could buy. Victory would depend on meticulous preparation, superior intelligence, and a strategy that was both brilliant and ruthless. He assembled a small, hand-picked team of bright, tireless young lawyers and accountants. From a suite of offices in Washington, they began the monumental task of mapping the Leviathan. For months, they worked in obscurity, poring over stock transfer books, corporate charters, and minutes from board meetings. They were not looking for a single smoking gun crime. Untermyer knew the men of the money trust were too smart for that. Their power was not derived from illegal acts, but from a perfectly legal, systemic web of influence that was more potent than any conspiracy. Untermyer's team began to trace the connections, and what emerged was a stunning portrait of a financial circulatory system controlled by a single heart. They focused on a concept they called interlocking directorates. They found that a small group of about 180 men, all partners or directors of the Morgan and Rockefeller financial empires, held a staggering 746 directorships in 112 of the nation's largest corporations: banks, insurance companies, railroads, public utilities, and industrial giants. It was a closed loop. A director of a Morgan-controlled bank would also sit on the board of a major railroad. That railroad, in turn, would only do business with a Morgan-controlled steel company. That steel company would only get its financing from a Morgan-controlled insurance firm. Credit, the bloodline of the economy, flowed only within this closed system. Any entrepreneur or company outside the circle found it nearly impossible to secure the capital needed to compete. It was a private, unelected government that could pick winners and losers, create monopolies, and strangle competition at will. Untermyer's genius was in realizing that he could not present this complex data to the public and expect them to understand. The spider's web was too intricate. He needed a narrative. He needed a villain. While the money trust was a system, it had a face, a name, and a beating heart. That heart was J.P. Morgan. Untermyer decided to structure the hearings like a great drama, building suspense with each witness. He would start with the lesser figures, the bank presidents, the stock exchange managers, the corporate functionaries. With each one, he would lay another piece of the puzzle, slowly revealing the scope of the system to the public and the press. He would save the king for last. The hearings began in the spring of 1912. The committee room in Washington became the stage for one of the greatest spectacles in American political history. Untermyer was in his element. He sat at the council table, calm and impeccably dressed, a stack of documents before him. He was a master of the cross-examination, a predatory artist. He never shouted, never lost his temper. His voice was a quiet, insistent, almost hypnotic drone. He would begin with gentle, almost friendly questions, lulling the powerful witnesses into a false sense of security. Then, with the timing of a surgeon, he would strike. He would produce a document, a letter, a minute from a meeting, and confront the witness with their own words. He would trap them in contradictions, expose their self-serving logic, and peel back the layers of corporate jargon to reveal the simple, ugly truth of their power. One by one, the titans of Wall Street marched to the witness stand, and one by one, they were humbled. George F. Baker, the taciturn head of the First National Bank, was forced to admit that the concentration of credit in a few hands had gone far enough. William Rockefeller, brother of John D., proved a slippery and evasive witness, but Untermyer's relentless questioning painted a clear picture of his role in the web. The press was captivated. Newspapers across the country ran daily front-page stories of the hearings.
For the first time, the American public was getting a glimpse into the secret chambers of high finance. Untermyer was becoming a folk hero, the people's lawyer, the man who dared to challenge the gods. All of this was a prelude to the main event. In the fall, Untermyer played his final card. He issued a subpoena for John Pierpont Morgan himself. The news landed like a thunderclap. J.P. Morgan, a man who summoned others but was never summoned, was being ordered to testify. His army of lawyers fought back furiously, arguing that his health was too fragile, that the ordeal would be too much for the 75-year-old titan. Untermyer was unyielding. He knew the entire investigation would be meaningless without Morgan. He threatened to have the sergeant-at-arms of the House of Representatives physically arrest Morgan if he did not comply. Finally, grudgingly, Morgan agreed. He would appear in December. The stage was set for the final confrontation. It would be a duel of titans, Samuel Untermyer, the master of the law, versus John Pierpont Morgan, the master of capital. The people's lawyer versus the king of the money trust. The fate of an era hung in balance.
Part 3. The Leviathan on the Stand. On the morning of December 18, 1912, the caucus room of the House Office Building was charged with an electric tension unlike anything Washington had seen. Every seat was filled. Journalists from across the world crammed into the aisles, their notebooks ready. In the front row sat the nation's most powerful financiers, there to witness the interrogation of their patriarch. A hush fell over the room as J.P. Morgan entered. He was a Leviathan in winter, 75 years old, but still possessing an immense physical presence. He walked with a heavy, deliberate tread, leaning on a cane. His famous eyes, deep-set and fiercely intelligent, scanned the room with an expression of profound impatience and contempt. He was not here as a defendant. He was here as a sovereign monarch, granting an audience to a lesser body out of a grudging sense of noblesse oblige. He took his seat at the witness table, directly across from Samuel Untermyer. The two men were a study of contrasts. Morgan, the massive, imposing Anglo-Saxon titan of inherited power. Untermyer, the small, precise, self-made Jewish lawyer. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air crackling between them. Untermyer began, his voice deceptively soft. He did not open with an accusation, but with a series of seemingly innocuous questions about the nature of banking and credit. He was mapping the terrain, establishing a foundation of facts. Morgan answered in short, guttural bursts, his voice a low rumble of annoyance. He fidgeted, played with his cigar, and made no secret of his disdain for the proceedings. Untermyer's strategy was brilliant. He knew he could not trap Morgan on a specific point of law. Instead, he sought to expose the man's philosophy, his worldview. He wanted Morgan to explain, in his own words, why he believed his immense power was not only acceptable, but necessary and good. The questioning slowly tightened. Untermyer began to probe the core of the matter, the concentration of credit. "You are a great international banker, are you not, Mr. Morgan?" Untermyer asked. "I believe so," he grumbled.
Untermyer then led him through a list of the directorships he and his partners held, painting a verbal picture of the vast, interconnected empire. Morgan listened, his impatience growing. Then came the central question, the one upon which the entire hearing turned. Untermyer leaned forward slightly, his voice still quiet, but now edged with steel. "I want to ask you, Mr. Morgan, whether you do not think that the control of credit and of money is a dangerous power to be concentrated in the hands of a few men." This was the heart of the matter. Morgan looked at him, his eyes flashing. For the first time he seemed truly engaged. He saw this not as a legal question, but a philosophical one. "It depends on who the men are," Morgan replied, his voice firm. The room stirred. It was a stunningly honest admission. Power was not dangerous, Morgan was saying, as long as it was held by the right people, men like him. Untermyer pressed his advantage. "Is not a concentration of control of money and credit in a few hands a dangerous thing to the country?" Morgan leaned back, defiant. "No." He then launched into a defense of his philosophy. "The most important thing in business," he declared, "was not money or property. The first thing is character," he boomed. "A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. I think that is the fundamental basis of business." It was meant to be a noble, powerful statement, but in Untermyer's hands it became the ultimate weapon against him. Untermyer deftly turned the statement on its head. If credit was based on a subjective assessment of character, and if Morgan and his small circle of partners were the sole judges of that character, then it was nothing less than a system of personal, arbitrary rule. It was a feudal system, not a democratic one. They were not bankers, they were kings, granting favors to their court and banishing those they deemed unworthy. For 2 days the duel continued. Untermyer was relentless, circling, probing, dissecting every answer. He forced Morgan to admit that he preferred cooperation and combination over wasteful competition. He made him acknowledge his power to create and destroy companies. By the end of the second day, Morgan was exhausted. The aura of invincibility was gone. He had not been broken, but he had been exposed. Untermyer had forced the god of Wall Street to descend from Olympus and explain himself to the mortals, and in doing so had revealed that the god's philosophy was fundamentally at odds with the American democratic ideal. Untermyer had not proven that Morgan had committed a crime. He had proven something far more devastating, that Morgan believed he had the right to rule. The Peugeot committee hearings concluded shortly after. J.P. Morgan, his health failing and his public mystique shattered, sailed for Europe. He died in Rome just 3 months later. His son, Jack, would later claim that it was Untermyer's relentless hounding that had killed him. The committee's final report, largely authored by Untermyer, became a national sensation. It was a clear, damning indictment of the money trust, laying out in meticulous detail the mechanisms of its control. It became the blueprint for the most significant wave of financial reform in American history. This was the final brilliant act of Samuel Untermyer's intellectual revenge. The public outcry and the political momentum generated by his hearings led directly to the passage of landmark legislation.
The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 explicitly banned interlocking directorates. The Federal Trade Commission was created to police anti-competitive practices, and most importantly, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was passed, creating a central banking system for the United States. This was the masterstroke. The creation of the Federal Reserve stripped away the very power that had made men like Morgan kings. No longer would the nation have to go, hat in hand, to a private banker to avert a crisis. The control of money and credit, which Morgan had argued was safe in his hands, was finally, decisively, placed under public and governmental authority. Samuel Untermyer never sent J.P. Morgan to prison. He never collected a financial penalty. His revenge was far more profound and lasting. He had faced the most powerful man in the world, not with a weapon of violence, but with the force of his intellect. He had challenged a system built on shadow and mystique and dragged it into the light. And with the law as his scalpel, he had surgically dismantled the invisible throne from which the money trust had ruled America. The people's lawyer had avenged not a personal wrong, but a systemic one, ensuring that no single man would ever again hold the economic fate of the nation in the palm of his hand.